What's up, guys? How you guys doing today, my fellow YouTubers? This is a Kung Fu Prepper, and this is a continuation from the video from Canadian Prepper's interview. It's revolved around what's going to happen in 2030. A lot on my mind about it. Uh, all I can say is, guys, prepare. Get your food, water, resources, house in order, plans in order. Uh, get what you need. Stay vigilant. Stay aware. Stay in tune. Um, Make sure you're when you're researching the right things. There's a lot of misleading things out there, and also this is not fear mongering. You can take it whatever you want. A grain of salt, as I say. But here we go, guys. Interview with Canadian Prepper with the scientists. Here we go.
And chew one of them things, and next thing you know.
Do I think it's too late? Honestly, yeah. Yeah, I think it's too late. We are on the cusp of losing habitat for human animals.
Is there anyone else who is saying what you're saying?
If they hear something like what I have to say, then it's going to cause mass chaos to break out. When was the last time you saw an ecologist interviewed on MSNBC or any other corporate media outlet for that matter? I don't think it's happening anymore because that would give up control of the message to somebody who actually understands the message. I have complete confidence that there won't be a human being on the planet in 2030. I think it's going to get much, much worse. Imagine when people realize they have not been told the truth. They have not been relayed the evidence. You deserve to know if you have a terminal diagnosis. And guess what, Homo sapiens? You have a terminal diagnosis. The peer-reviewed literature already indicates that we are losing habitat for vertebrates and for mammals around the world. I would love for them to be wrong, obviously, right? I don't want to die, much less have our whole species go extinct.
What are some of the tipping points? Like we always hear this thing, self-reinforcing positive feedback loops, just so people can comprehend the full scope of why this is unfolding, because maybe we haven't done it that justice with respect to explaining exactly what runaway climate change is. And maybe you can just elaborate on that a bit.
Right. So at my blog, guymcpherson.com, you can find an essay that I haven't updated for several years called Climate Change Summary. And it points out 68 irreversible self-reinforcing feedback loops. And that's a lot.
Wow.
And finally, the IPCC, incredibly conservative as it is, got on board and quoted several other peer-reviewed articles in AR6, their latest overall assessment, actually, in their IPCC special report on the ocean and cryosphere in a changing climate, published September 24th, 2019. They write, and I quote, "Ocean acidification and deoxygenation, ice sheet and glacier mass loss, and permafrost degradation are expected to be irreversible on timescales relevant to human societies and ecosystems." And they quote 5 peer-reviewed papers. This IPCC report indicated an overheated ocean was responsible for the irreversibility of climate change. So even the IPCC has admitted that we're in the midst of irreversible climate change. And I stopped updating my essay years before that report came out, and I identify 68 others. And in my foretold extinction ignored essay, also at guymcpherson.com, I identify a few more. So it only takes one, right? Climate change becomes irreversible as soon as we identify one self-reinforcing feedback loop, one factor that we set in motion and we can no longer stop.
What's the difference between Prop 26 and Prop 27? 26 doesn't fund California priorities like solving homelessness. Prop 27 guarantees permanent funding to
Gotta
solve
have
homelessness
that.
and addiction. The choice is clear. Yes on 27.
So we're there. We have triggered a multitude of these things, even if it's only one, as pointed out by the IPCC. So climate change is irreversible. It's more abrupt than any event in the history of the planet, according to the incredibly conservative political body known as the IPCC. To me, that's all we need to know about climate change, that it's abrupt and irreversible. Now, how do we live in light of that? And that's why I point to the other factors, that treating everybody like they're our dying grandmother, that sort of thing. You know, there are still things we can do to make lives better for others and for ourselves in the time that remains. And we don't know what day we're going to die. Another thing I always thought would be awesome is if it was stamped on everybody's forehead when they were going to die, but they couldn't see it, because then when you meet somebody, you go, oh yeah, tomorrow I better stay away from this guy.
That'd be interesting. That'd make a good movie. I'm not sure if you're familiar. I'm sure you are. You probably get 1,000 comments about grand solar minimum. A lot of people, this theory is going around that, and I know it's been thoroughly debunked by many very astute academics, but what is the problem with the grand solar minimum hypothesis? People suggesting that the Earth is actually cooling and that we're going back to an ice age sometime soon. I mean, it sounds, obviously, from your perspective, it probably sounds quite foolish, but maybe you can explain the science of why that's false.
Well, one, we've actually been keeping records for a couple of 100 years. And within the last 50 years, climate scientists have figured out how to adjust for things like the urban heat island effect, to adjust for the changes in temperature that have occurred over time because we put the thermometers in cities instead of out in the country, right? So obviously cities retain the heat longer than places out in the country. So once you do all that, all you need is the records that we've had for centuries to know that the planet is warming. In addition, tack on the proxy records we use, such as tree rings and geological formations that indicate differences in global average temperature over time. So at this point, we have abundant evidence indicating that the planet is warming, not cooling, that we're not on the verge of a little ice age or a big ice age. And I think the primary reason that people continue to promote this idea of the solar minimum is because it's really, really difficult to give up hope. It's really challenging for any of us to accept that we are ever going to die, much less that it's going to be sometime in the near future, much less that it's because of something we had no control over. Right? When I was 14 years old and got my first driver's license, I was not the least bit concerned about how many miles I drove or how fast I went. And I suspect most people, at least most males of the species, fall into the same category. So we're done. We're done.
Do you think that, sorry, go ahead.
And I don't know how to deal with people that just can't handle the fact that we're done. I mean, all the evidence points in one direction, and I understand that evidence is difficult to take on, just as it's difficult to take on the idea that you have a terminal diagnosis. But
so you think it's like a grieving?
Yes, absolutely. And correct me if I'm wrong about this one, but everybody dies. You know, every single person who has lived has died, except for the relatively few of us who are left here, nearly 8 billion. I guess that's quite a few. But we're all going to die too. Come to grips with it. Yes, it's difficult. I get that. I remember quite clearly an event that happened when I was 11 years old. And that's amazing because that's been quite a few years ago. And my grandmother died. And I barely knew her, right? We saw her once a year. So since I actually reached the ability to remember somebody, I'd seen her maybe 5 or 6 times. That's it. And I cried for weeks. And many years later, I realized that I wasn't crying for her. I didn't even know the woman. I was crying for me, because that's when it hit home, when I was 11 years old, that I too was going to die, that everybody dies. And that's what I was having the hard time taking in and dealing with, is that it's going to affect me too. It's not just my ancient grandmother who I barely knew, it's all of us. So that's tough, and I suspect by the time most people are 12 or 14 years old, they've had a similar experience. They've realized that they too are going to die. And it's not pleasant for any of us, but it affects everybody. Every living thing dies. I'm not a therapist, I'm not a counselor, but I understand the grief that people go through and try to help people deal with that the best that I can, because I was unfortunate enough to get there before most people. So I've been dealing with this idea of abrupt irreversible climate change for more than a decade now. It's hard.
It seems like, on the one hand, people are skeptical because they don't trust the government, they don't trust institutions, they don't trust people flying around in private jets telling them that they need to use less. So on the one hand, it's that, but there's also perhaps a defense mechanism here at work, which is not wanting to obviously have to change anything about the way we live, which is ironic because as preppers and survivalists and people who want to live a self-reliant life, it usually entails a certain level of minimalism. So going off grid, living with less and being happier. So yet we were reluctant, many people within this community are reluctant to accept that this is happening because of the people who are telling them it's happening, even though the people who are telling them it's happening aren't telling them the full extent of what's going on, like you're saying. So the reality is, though, is that, we're all seeking this more simple existence where we enjoy the things that are free in life, because that's what matters most. The best things in life are really free, the things that we remember anyways.
And I get it. I was there. I lived off grid for more than a decade. I pursued the simple life. I worked my ass off. I weighed 165 pounds. I'm 6'3". I was skin and sinew and a couple of bones thrown in there. I mean, I just worked my ass off to try to pursue this simpler life. And I got there at great expense and that expense came in many ways. I would love to believe that we are not on the verge of human extinction. I would love to believe that. And
aiming for financial progress? Consolidating debt with a personal loan can help. One combined payment every month can make things simple.
And that's what I was living for. That's why I changed my entire life, turned it upside down, was so that I would be in a position to live for a long time, along with the people I loved. But I have nothing left to lose, unlike the enormous privilege that most academics have to lose. I have nothing. I have nothing remaining except the love of a decent woman and maybe the love of a few other people. That's it. So I'm trying the best I can, inspired by people like Carl Sagan, to relay scientific information in a manner that people can understand it easily. And it's hard to take on this information. I'm the first to admit that. I don't want to believe it myself, but I can't avoid it. I can't avoid what the data say.
I think it's worth emphasizing that many people are skeptical about what the IPCC is saying, yet you are going many steps further and suggesting that no, it is actually far worse than we're being told because of all the things that we've just discussed. And a lot of people will get their back up against the wall when they hear something like this, because right away it's like, okay, well, what's the catch? What do you want from me, right? And you're not saying that you want anything, which is, it's a hard. This is what's compelling about your position. The only criticism I guess somebody might levy is, how we presume that within our lifetimes things are going to happen. Like we have this bias of, the end is going to happen in our lifetime as opposed to 2100. What do you make of the kicking the can down the road in the year 2100? that's when things are going to start happening. What do you make of that? Is it just them trying to push it back? Like, 'cause it's 2040, it's 2030, it's 2050. It's never right now that it's happening.
I had a long conversation that was recorded and is on the Nature Bats last YouTube channel with a guy who said the same thing. He said, "Listen, all I hear is 2100. I'm going to stick with 2100 for now. Why don't you try to talk me out of that?" And so this conversation lasted, like I said, more than an hour. I think partner Pauline reduced it down to 40 minutes or something like that. But I walked through all the things that are happening right now as reported in the very conservative peer-reviewed literature. The oceans are dying. And you don't need me to tell you that. You can read that in almost any newspaper these days. The oceans are dying. Pick a specific location. The methane is flowing out of the oceans, the East Siberian Arctic Shelf, Antarctica, and many places on land. There's the planetary heating is beyond crazy and faster than anything climate scientists could have even imagined in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. There's a lot happening, and it all points in the wrong direction. I would love to think otherwise, and my life would certainly be better were I able to think otherwise. I would still have a lot of people in my life that are no longer in my life, but I can't not present the evidence as I understand it. People tell me all the time that the powers that be, the government officials, the media personalities, and so on, are not telling the full truth because if they hear something like what I have to say, then it's going to cause mass chaos to break out the day after tomorrow. Imagine when people realize they have not been told the truth, they have not been relayed the evidence, and then the water stops coming through the taps. Then the food stops showing up at the grocery stores. Do you think people are going to be pretty happy at that point? I don't think so. So I adhere to the notion that people have the right to know what I know, and so I make the information freely available, even though I don't make any money and haven't for a long time, because I think people deserve to know what the hell's going on. And who else is telling? I can't find anybody. Anybody who talks like I do gets deemed crazy. In fact, that's what an AP reporter actually said. He said, "You lived off grid? That makes you crazy. That doesn't make you right." I was just trying to make sacrifices.
And the thing is, this is a common strategy that we know has been employed as recently as the Ukraine war, where President Zelensky knew that the invasion was going to happen and didn't tell his population because he didn't want to incite a panic. So, right. And one could say, okay, that's justified in some ways because if an right? No, I'm just playing a devil's advocate for a sec here. So
we got panic happening right now.
Right, of course. From their perspective, it's continuity of government, but. Right. The panic just gets drawn out, perhaps. So right. It's not unreasonable to think, and it shouldn't be, and people should be suspicious that maybe the same thing is playing out with the whole climate change thing. They know how bad it is. They know how bad it's going to get, but they're greenwashing it, and they're making it seem redeemable and seem as though there's going to be a magic solution at the last minute, when the reality is there's not. And like you said, it's going to be a slow grind. And then suddenly these things, like we're already hearing in Europe with the energy crisis, you could say it's the result of the war, or you could say it's just the inevitable result of everything coming to a head at once. But how they're going to be struggling to keep warm this winter. Food prices are going to go through the roof. There's going to be deindustrialization there as a result of less gas flowing through the pipes to fuel industrialization. So, maybe this is it. Maybe it's starting. Maybe the war and the pandemic was just, the first phase of that. But at the same time, I also know, and perhaps to provide people a bit of hope, is that we are resilient in some ways. Like the system has demonstrated resilience as well. I was listening to a discussion yesterday where they were talking about how the ocean fisheries peaked in the 90s And since then, it's been like on a downward,
Right.
it's taking more and more energy to go into deeper to deeper waters to get less and less fish. But this guy was also talking about how, well, if you leave it for 15 years, the fish will probably come back. So, as much as I agree with what you're saying, that they're probably not telling us how bad it is, I still want to hope that there might be some solution. It might be technological, or it might simply be that, there's a Malthusian catastrophe and billions of people die, but billions rebuild in a new, more symbiotic way with the environment.
I'm right there with you. I'd love to believe that. I would. The evidence tells me otherwise, especially the evidence about aerosol masking. We can't slow down, much less stop this set of living arrangements without rapidly overheating the planet. I wish it were otherwise. And that's why I lived off grid all those years, because I thought that was the way and I was going to inspire people. That didn't quite pan out, to follow my lead and live simply and live differently. In this version of civilization, it seems like there's exactly one way to live. And if you don't live that way, there's something wrong with you. You go to school some more, you fall in love, you have 2.5 children, you work until you are too broken to work anymore, and then you retire and you get paychecks for your retirement and blah, blah, blah. And it just goes on forever, right? But we know better than that.
Is there anyone else who is saying what you're saying? Like, is there anybody else who is starting to speak up or is painting as grim, bleak of a picture as you are, or as realistic a picture as you are?
It's pretty interesting because I only cite peer-reviewed literature and the people who produce those papers. So at the level of each individual piece of evidence, of course people agree with me. The 15 people who co-wrote a peer-reviewed article agree that I'm quoting their paper correctly. Is there anybody out there who's putting the whole thing together and pointing out that the loss of habitat is going to lead to loss of our species? If so, they are hiding themselves quite well. I think that's partly because ecologists are few and far between in the climate science community and effectively absent from corporate media. Paul Ehrlich, renowned, now 90 years old, renowned for writing The Population Bomb in 1968, actually co-wrote it with his wife, Anne. But, of course, according to the publisher, women can't possibly know anything about overpopulation, so they wouldn't let her name be on the book. They've subsequently written more than 15 books together. And he was on the news all the time in the 70s and 80s, because that's how the corporate media acted. They sought out these individuals who were renowned and reliable and had them on the air. So he was an environmental correspondent, I think, for ABC News. He was on a couple of times a week for years. When was the last time you saw an ecologist interviewed on MSNBC or any other corporate media outlet for that matter? I don't think it's happening anymore, because that would give up control of the message to somebody who actually understands the message, instead of to people who want a certain message to be heard. Anyway.
Wouldn't it be great if you can manage and read your mail when away on business, on vacation, or abroad?
Is there a certain point that people are going to, is there like a panic point that you foresee? At what point are people going to realize, things are bad and they're not going to improve? And when do you foresee that happening, and how do you see that taking shape on the ground? You talk about the inability to grow food. Now, obviously that's going to affect developing countries first, which will ultimately lead to a refugee crisis, which the timeline might be refugee crisis, destabilizing Western countries or more wealthy countries where there's still food, and that leading to political chaos, possibly some sort of fascism or something emerging in response to it. At least that's the only way. I'm trying to anticipate how this is going to play out, because we're talking about a very small period of time between now and 2030, right?
Absolutely. And
Wow.
have you not noticed that
8 years.
fascism has already taken place in the United States government? I
Yeah.
mean, it's very difficult for me to distinguish fascism from our federal government since 1981 or so. And in fact, there's peer-reviewed evidence to support that idea that we have been following this line of fascism in this country for a long time, and it's worse than it's ever been. But let's say it's going to get worse. Look at those underdeveloped countries that you just spoke about. It's already happening. I lived in Belize for about 2.5 years. This was starting in July or August of 2016, and it was already happening. Somebody would leave there, and most of the property owners were from Western Europe or Canada or the United States, and they came there with a little bit of money so they could buy some property. And then if they had to leave, they would ask some local person to keep an eye out for them. They would ask that person to move in, and they almost always did, because it was a pretty cushy set of living arrangements for people who grew up in Belize. I've heard many stories and had them verified of people who came back to their homestead after being gone for a month or 6 months. It's gone, stripped bare. The person taking care of it left, had a family obligation, or decided they wanted this stuff, so they stripped the place down. It's already happening. When I was on a speaking tour in Western Europe in late 2015, I tend to think of Europeans as being far more enlightened, respectful than people from the United States. And yet almost everybody I came across in the 8 countries I spoke in was complaining about the refugees coming up from Northern Africa and the Middle East and invading their country because they didn't have enough for a bunch of new people. And we see the same thing in the South, in this country. And when Trump was president, he tried to crack down really hard on refugees that were leaving because habitat was being lost for human animals where they lived. That's already well underway in Mexico, Costa Rica, Belize, San Salvador, and so on. So it's already happening. A lot of people haven't noticed yet. It certainly does not appear in the news on a regular basis. But you can find the information. You don't have to work very hard to understand that the refugee crisis is already underway, and it has been for a while.
Yeah, and I do foresee it getting a lot worse, especially, of course, as the places that are most affected are developing countries. And another part of the puzzle that a lot of people are not thinking about is that a lot of these developing countries are going to start to industrialize or attempt to. And if they're trying to do that while energy becomes more and more scarce, there's going to be, if they are successful in industrializing, that's great for them for the short term, but that also means even more, faster warming, I guess you could say, faster, more rapid change.
Right.
Do you have any thoughts on how peak energy, peak oil, how that factors into this climate chaos?
Absolutely. It's certainly contributing to it, and will contribute it to a far higher level in the near future. I think that's one of the great existential threats we face is global peak oil. It's been, depending on whether you believe the EIA or the IEA, the United States Energy Information Assessments, or the European version of the same thing. We had global peak oil in either 2004 or 2005. And as Robert Hirsch indicated in what has commonly become known as the Hirsch Report, we need 20 years taking serious government action to prepare for peak oil. And he said, if we throw everything we have at it, maybe we can get by in 10 years and maintain societal civilization. Well, that was 2005 or 2006. That's 16 or 17 and a half years ago. I think it's going to get much, much worse. And a primary reason I keep doing the work I'm doing is because in my dreams, and probably only there, people behave like they do in the short story. I think it was published in 1949 by Ray Bradbury. You can find it online. It's called The Last Night of the World, and it's by Ray Bradbury. And everybody knew that it was the last night in the world. Everybody knew that they were going to die in their sleep tonight. And nobody freaked out because it was affecting everybody. Nobody on the East Coast flew to the West Coast so they could get 3 more hours of wonderful lives. The privilege just didn't matter. Everybody knew. So in my dreams, and probably only there, I envision people knowing, because people like you and people like me have been telling them that we're running out of habitat, and in the not too distant future, it's going to affect everybody. And so I
How are you being so chill about this? I already found a personal loan through Credit Karma, and I could see my estimated terms and approval odds up front, so I'm relaxed.
I can imagine that people don't go crazy. People know what's coming. They see the signs when they hit their own neighborhood, and they act like a decent human being. This is why, after living more than 10 years off grid, learning how to grow all my own food, how to preserve all that food, become a master cheesemaker, blah, 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 all that stuff, right? I gave up on it because I needed to do this, because I needed to inform people what's coming so that maybe they can act like reasonable human beings, like rational human beings when the end does come. And as a consequence, my partner Pauline and I have on this property enough food to last a few weeks. We have a water filter so that we can have decent water to drink, and we have enough food with that water to last us a few weeks if it's just the 2 of us, and half of a few weeks if we take on more people, which I doubt we're reluctant to do. So we have a water supply for a short time and a food supply for a short time. And that matches what we did in my family when I was a kid. I lived in this little village of 700 people called Weippe, Idaho. It was a 3.5-hour drive to a real grocery store. So we always had lots of food in the fridge and on the shelves, because we didn't know we might not get to Lewiston, Idaho next month because of the weather. So we had to have a couple of months supply of food for 5 people in the house. It was really bad food, but it was enough to get through. I think if the system goes down or is greatly reduced in industrial activity for more than a couple of months, then we're in real trouble because we lose aerosol masking. And so that's why we are taking a relatively short-term approach. But on the other hand, because of things like this, a certain pandemic, or any number of other factors that might disrupt civil society, we're prepared to last a few weeks, maybe 4 or 5 weeks with food so that we don't have to depend upon the grocery store. Beyond that, I don't see people behaving very nicely. So we aren't prepared to persist much longer than that. And we don't have weapons like I did the whole time I was a kid. Got rid of all those when I moved to Belize because of their rather draconian British-inspired gun laws. And so, we're just living this relatively simple life, trying to inform people what's going on in the world and what is likely to emerge in the future, and living with urgency and living simply and living with love. And if you can find a better way to live, we're completely open to the ideas.
Well, I would encourage people to go and check out your YouTube channel, where you upload quite frequently, a couple times a week.
Yeah, typically on Mondays and Thursdays, but it just sort of...
On one note, you guys make sure you check out that channel. I already subscribed, but make sure you check out his channel. Very insightful.
Depends on our local schedule and who's coming to visit. And that's the Nature Bats Last YouTube channel.
And Nature Bats Last is also a website?
Yes, it's Nature Bats Last, but it's found at guymcpherson.com.
And the phrase Nature Bats Last itself is rather interesting, I
Yeah,
must
it's a
say.
baseball. Yeah, it's a baseball metaphor, right? So in the United States, where everybody knows what baseball is, everybody knows that the home team bats last, and the ultimate home team is the natural world. So as the home team, you can make a comeback. You can be 15 runs behind going into the bottom of the ninth, and yet in the ninth inning, right, you can come up with 17 runs and you win the game. Nature bats last. Nature bats first too, but that doesn't sound so clever.
All right. Well, I would definitely encourage people to go and check out that YouTube channel. Make sure you subscribe and yeah, give it a shot. And hopefully we are able to have this conversation again in a few years.
Okay, guys. Well, that sounds like that's it from that interview with Canadian Prepper and the scientist. If you guys want to subscribe to his channel, follow the details through the link from what he just said. And in ending, prepare, stay aware, know that just to keep everything in order, be, as I want to say, have patience with one another, love one another, treat each other with respect. That goes a long way. Don't forget to get your butter from a duck and water from a dry river, guys. It's getting late. Gotta get up in the morning and get the kids ready for school. But I had to do this video for you guys. Till next time, guys. Kung Fu Prepper out.